Okay, so now we're going to look at the law. So Moses has gone up on Mount Sinai after the Exodus. God's spoken to him. And then now the Israelites, they all come to the foot of Mount Sinai and God speaks to them. Right? Now, point one. First thing that happens is God starts explaining the history between himself and the Israelites. And in Exodus chapter 20, verse 2, he says, I, the Lord, am your God, who brought you from the land of Egypt, from the house of slavery. And what's interesting is that this was the common way in those days to start a treaty that was called a suzerain treaty. Now, a suzerain would be the lord of a land who has just beaten another land. And he ends up being called the suzerain, and the people he's conquered, or the king he's conquered, is called the vassal. And what would happen in these suzerain treaties is the suzerain would then make a treaty with the vassal, and he would start off explaining the history of how he knew them, like, I defeated you in battle, or something like that. Well, in this case, God says, I, the Lord, am your God, who brought you from the land of Egypt, from the house of slavery. So what God's doing is he's talking to them in language they would understand. He's using the treaty language of those days that people would understand. He's actually showing them that he's making a covenant with them, and he's talking in language that they will get, and showing that it's all based on the fact that he took them out of slavery. Now the second thing that happens, point 2, is he then gives them the 10 Commandments. This is Exodus chapter 20, verses 3 to 17. You can read it later. He gives them the 10 Commandments, and these 10 Commandments are very general, and they show God's will for how his people should live. And I'd say they show his will for how people should always live. But then, the third thing that happens, God gives specific laws to Moses. This is in the next few chapters, Exodus chapter 21 all the way through to Exodus chapter 23. Now God gives specific laws to Moses. These are just to Moses because the people have said to Moses, talk to God on your own, we're too scared. And these laws are very specific. They are very specific, and they're actually case decisions. They're case decisions. The Hebrew word used for these things is, sorry, I've had a mental block now on my Hebrew. Mishpat. 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 I'm sorry, one of those two. Anyway, and now this is the word for judgments, which is used quite often for talking about case decisions that are based on some previous general law. So what we've got here is we've got a whole bunch of case decisions made that's based on the previous general 10 Commandments. So what's happening now is God is giving specific instructions so that Moses and the Israelites know how to apply the 10 Commandments to everyday life. So can everyone see this? You've got the general 10 Commandments. God says this is how my people should live. And then after that, God gives specific examples of how this works in everyday life. Does that make sense? Yeah. And what's interesting is that these laws are very similar to ancient Near Eastern laws of those days. So you look at the Code of Hammurabi, you see that it's the same kind of laws, but what we find is God is reshaping the laws that were common in those days, and he's making them specific to his people. One example is human life is given more value than it was in ancient Near Eastern law. I think in Egypt, property had more value than humans. So if you rob someone, more would happen to you. You get a worse punishment than if you killed someone. Whereas with Yahweh, he really values human life because humans are made in the image of God. And obviously throughout the law, it's all to do with being in a relationship with Yahweh, being his people, being a holy nation. So it's different to the laws of those days, but it's still written in the same kind of language that people would recognise. Okay, now the point I want to make here is that because God specifically gets the 10 Commandments and applies them specifically to their culture, it would be wrong for us to take what's written in Exodus chapters 21 to 23. It'd be wrong to take those things and directly apply them today because we live in a different culture. But what we can do is get the 10 Commandments, which are quite general and broad. We can get the principles of the 10 Commandments and we can apply those to our culture today. Now the fourth thing that happens is that the people then ratify this covenant in Exodus 24. And they're saying, yeah, we're down with this covenant. Now with a suzerain vassal treaty, you didn't really have much choice anyway, because the guys just overpowered your land. So you have to say, yeah, we agree with this. In this case, God has actually saved them from slavery and said, I'm your Lord. And they are now saying, yes, we agree with this, we'll do it. And they actually said earlier they do it, but they say it again in Exodus 24, by making sacrifices, and they sprinkle half of the blood on the altar, and they sprinkle half of the blood on the people. And this is called the blood of the covenant. Remember that phrase, the blood of the covenant. And some people think that what they're saying is, may our blood be poured out if we don't keep to this covenant. And of course we find out throughout the Old Testament that they don't keep to this covenant.